Hello and welcome to another episode of Laptop Retrospective, and this episode is brought to you by Greg Moser for donating this laptop right here. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the video. Hello and welcome to another episode of Laptop Retrospective, and today we have another kind of beginning. And what I've got here is actually the ThinkPad Yoga. And this is the original, and it is known in many circles by many different names, the Gen 1, the S1, or the S240. So if you're looking for these online, you can use any of those names and you should be able to come up with it. Released in 2013, the ThinkPad Yoga borrowed from the IdeaPad Yoga 13 that was released in December of 2012. When this model was finally released in 2013, it was seen as a successor, or a spiritual successor at the very least, to the X230T, because it was of course a ThinkPad in this configuration and size, but it also had tablet capability. Now, how they approach the tablet mechanism is a story we'll get to in just a moment, but let's take a step back and talk about the origins. You see, if you have a copy of this book, and if you're a ThinkPad fan, I highly suggest that you do have one, and that is How the ThinkPad Changed the World and is Shaping the Future, written by Aramasa Naito. He goes into detail on a lot of different ThinkPad projects throughout the history of the brand. However, there is some interesting information about this specific model in this book, located on pages 138 to 140. Inside the book, we have several anecdotes that point to the development of the Yoga. The first is actually when Naito was the head of ThinkPad development. This was, of course, ThinkPad is still working in the business class, but there was a series of Lenovo engineers working on another innovation, and it was what would eventually become the four-way convertible notebook, and it had that 360-degree hinge. And I won't dive into all the details that are covered in here, but it did lead to an interesting development because you had essentially the ThinkPad team and then the rest of Lenovo's computer team. Fast forwarding a bit after 2008 to 2011, Naito was reassigned as Chief Development Officer for all of Lenovo, not just for ThinkPad, and that led to some interesting crossover and collaboration. Obviously, Naito has a lot of experience with ThinkPad and is bringing that now to the entire company. The Yoga was in development by Lenovo branch. It wasn't a ThinkPad product originally. However, they were running into a lot of challenges and a lot of trouble with it. So Naito actually sent ThinkPad engineers to work on the Yoga so it could be finally released. And of course, there's more details in the book, but that's essentially what ends up happening. Even though there was a lot of ThinkPad fingerprints on the original Yoga that launched under the IdeaPad brand, it wasn't until the next year that they actually brought the Yoga to ThinkPad. Now, when they did bring it to ThinkPad, they made a significant number of improvements. One of the most iconic has to be the lift and lock keyboard. So if you take a look at this keyboard, you can obviously press the keys and everything works as expected. Once the hinge goes past a certain point, it's about 270 degrees, there is a deck that rises up and actually locks the keys from moving, and then 2 feet on either side of the keyboard will extend beyond the chassis. So not only do you not need to worry about key presses while the device is being held, but if it's resting on a table, there is no contact with the bottom of the machine and the table. These 4 rubberized feet at the top and bottom of the deck hold it off of the desk. This lift and lock design would be with the Yoga for an extended period of time. It was only up until recently that they no longer put it in their models. And how the lift and lock works is essentially there is a wire, a steel wire that runs through the keyboard mechanism, and Naito describes it in detail in the book, that essentially gets pulled taut, raising up that deck and locking the keyboard. So it's a pretty cool piece of engineering. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the specifications. The display, of course, is probably one of the most important parts. And this came in 1366 by 768 or a 1920 by 1080 panel. And this is what we've got here, is a 1080 display. In terms of CPU options, you had a pretty wide gamut. You had the i3 410U or 4030U, the i5 4200, 4210, or 4300U, and then the i7 4500, 4510, or 4600U. Regardless of which CPU you had, you were running Intel HD Graphics 4400, and then you had 4 or 8 gigabytes of DDR3 low power memory at 1600 megahertz on the board. A 2.5-inch drive bay is located inside the machine, as well as an M.2 2242 slot that can be used for an SSD as well. Wireless options came in 2 flavors, either the wireless N7260 or the AC7260. All of this is being powered, of course, by a 46 watt-hour battery that takes up a good chunk of the inside. In terms of ports, we actually have an excellent selection here. Starting on the right-hand side, we have Kensington lock slot, a mini HDMI port, a USB 3.0 port, SD card slot, a lock button, volume up and down, the power button, and a place to store the pen. On the right-hand side, we have a headphone microphone combo jack, a USB 3.0 always-on port, and then the charging port as well as the one-link connector dock port. So this does support those one-link docks with those really fat plugs. Now, it is worth pointing out that it does feature the probably less than popular ClickPad that had no buttons. However, this can be swapped out with the Yoga 12 that came out the following year, and that has a much nicer trackpad setup. In fact, I actually have one here, and I like to refer to it as the battle damaged model because this one has been through an awful lot. As you can see, just because it was a convertible doesn't mean that it wasn't durable. They really used that magnesium aluminum hybrid to the fullest extent. As you can see, this one has had a rough life. The Yoga 12 is really easy to identify because they simply badged it the Yoga 12. And on the inside, you had 5th gen CPUs, the i3 510, the i5 5200, 5300, and then the i7 5500 and 5600U. You had a nicer graphics setup, but your RAM configurations were 8 gigabytes, and that was it. And you could only get a 1920 by 1080 display. So they took essentially the least popular options from the Yoga and they didn't even offer them, giving you pretty much a much nicer, if you can find it, computer in the Yoga 12. But that's not to say that the original Yoga isn't an excellent value for money either. The Yoga 12 that came out in 2014 also featured a 14-inch variant, which I've actually already featured on this channel, and I'll leave a link up there even though it is an older video. So let's go ahead and open up both of these so we can see the differences and see the core components that you would want to service. We'll start with our nicer example first. And it is a simple and trivial matter of loosening all the screws on the bottom. I did note that some of these aren't captive. I'm not too sure if that's the case on all of the models. And don't forget, there is one in the middle here as well. So once all of these are loose, it's a relatively simple matter of just grabbing the top and peeling back. Once we're on the inside, everything is facing us that we would need to service. We do have our Wi-Fi card, our M.2 slot, the battery, the 2.5-inch drive bay, and that's realistically all you're going to be changing out. We've also got the CMOS battery hanging out in the top right-hand corner, and we can actually get a really good look at the very complex hinge mechanism in the Yoga. Now, when we open this up, we can see that nothing's really going on with that hinge mechanism quite yet, but as we move it past that magical point, we can see that both of these pieces will begin to move. And what that does is raise that lift and lock and put tension on that system. And we can also see it moving down here as well. So as you can see, a lot of engineering went into that design, no question about it. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the Yoga 12 looks like on the inside. All of the screws are located in the same place. So if you've taken apart a Yoga, you have essentially at least opened up a Yoga 12. Once we have all the screws out, the process remains the same. This one is a little stiff on the left-hand side, so we'll just give it some help. There we go. And just like before, we are able to get into this machine. We have a hard drive in this one, battery, Wi-Fi card, the M.2 slot. Everything else is more or less in the place where it should be. From what I can tell, the two essentially look identical. So as you can see, very easy to service these machines. Even this one that has seen a lot of action. There's some dust and buildup on the hinge component over there. This computer has seen a hard life, but that is the fate of some ThinkPads, and they wear it with a badge of honor. This mechanism feels just as good as the pristine example that was donated. So what we're going to do is we're going to put these machines back together, and I'm going to go ahead and turn on the original Yoga and do a quick boot test, and then we'll draw some conclusions. All right, now that we have it back together, let's go ahead and turn it on. So as you can see, we are looking at a pretty respectable boot time, and it is a really great display from all angles. You of course have touch with the finger. So of course you have access to the stylus, which you can use for all sorts of note-taking activities. So if I go ahead and flip this over into tablet mode, I can take full advantage of all the different tools that I might need. And of course, it supports multi-touch, which is great, especially for an older device, and is pretty responsive, all things considered. So realistically, ladies and gentlemen, the Yoga and Yoga 12 and Yoga 14 are really good value for money, especially if you're looking for a decent tablet experience in the year 2021 on a budget. You can usually find the ThinkPad Yoga 12 around 300 Canadian dollars, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, depending on how it's configured. And that's not too bad considering the functionality and the durability that you're getting. As you saw from my battle damaged sample, these things wear pretty well. Like, that thing is in rough shape, but the worst it has is some keycaps missing and some cosmetic work that's needed to be done. But by and large, you're usually finding these things in better condition than that anyway. If you are looking for a newer Yoga, then of course you can head over to Lenovo and pick one up there as well. But if you are more, strapped on a budget and you don't mind running a slightly older laptop, then there's still a lot of value and a lot of performance that you can get out of a machine like this. At any rate, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you've enjoyed this sort of content, and if you did, I would encourage you to do the big four. Please like the video, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, so the next time I get the opportunity to feature a Yoga or two, you will be the first to know about it. Thank you so much, and I shall see you next time.